Well, good afternoon from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and we are so glad to have you today. Today is all about how deep listening can help us when it comes to conflict, and ultimately how that conflict can help us solve problems. Joining us in studio is Katrina Nobles, the Director of Conflict Program for the Scheinman Institute, and Liz Davis-Frost, Mediation and Training Extension Associate, also at the Scheinman Institute under the Cornell ILR School. Katrina also happens to be faculty author of our Conflict Resolution Certificate Program, and this also happens to be part 2 of our conversation on deep listening. Liz, Katrina, thank you so much for joining us and being back with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is so great to have you. And audience, just some quick housekeeping. We will be fielding your questions throughout, so please feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll kind of get to them as much as we can. Also, we want to ask you a couple questions as well, so please make sure to scan the QR code with your phone, and we'll be asking you a series of questions throughout to kind of help us tailor our conversation. And with that, so before we kind of delve into our conversation and everything like that, we want to learn a little bit about you, our audience. So again, scan this QR code with your phone, and we want to know what's a team project that you're currently working on, or you're kind of thinking about that's top of mind. And again, you can scan that QR code, and we'll get some of your responses here on this screen here. So it's so great to have you guys back in. And while we're kind of waiting for the audience's response, we had mentioned that this is part 2 of our conversation. So just real quickly, just to kind of remind our viewers, what is deep listening? And maybe Katrina, you can give us a little bit.
Sure. So kind of going back to the first session that we had together, probably the easiest way to explain it is that it is a skill or a tool that comes from the transformative mediation model or approach. And so it's often called focused listening in that sort of setting. And it relies on listening to listen. Right? So listening and being present, listening not to respond, not to kind of craft your opinion or come up with a solution, which many often of us are in the jobs that we're in because we're good problem solvers, right? So our brain automatically starts going to, okay, so how would we solve this problem? And deep listening or focused listening requires us to kind of step back and suspend our judgments.
Perfect. And audience, thank you so much for your responses. So we're slowly getting some things in. One thing that jumped out to me was staff recruiting. So when it comes to just, recruiting in general, is that an area where conflict can arise, especially when it comes to, maybe trying to be part of a team hiring somebody?
Absolutely.
Sure. I'd say like every area is an area where conflict can arise.
Okay, perfect.
But for sure, when there are decisions to be made and people have different opinions for different reasons, like things come up.
Very, very much. And audience, thank you so much for your responses. And we'll keep that QR code up for a little bit. So getting back to our conversation, how can conflict arise, especially when it comes to trying to solve, these big complex problems at work? And maybe Liz, we can hear from you first, and then Katrina.
Yeah. Kind of like I was just saying. I mean, when there are decisions to be made, we all have all of our brains work differently because we're all different people, and we're all the people that we are for a plethora of different reasons, right? So all of us are going to be approaching different situations in different ways. And then we also all are going to be communicating and sharing our thoughts and opinions in different ways. And so I feel like there's a ton of different types and levels of conflict that can come out of that. I mean, that particular example. And so yeah, it's it's like the name of the game, I feel like.
And Katrina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about complex problems, typically when I'm consulting with organizations and things like that, the complexity of the problem comes from the fact that there's sort of multiple layers and levels of conflict. So there might be a task conflict going on at the same time as a process conflict, at the same time as relationship conflicts, at the same time as intra-group and intergroup conflicts and differentiation of goals and scarcity of resources. And so it's complex because there's a lot of things to have conflict over.
And they're all interacting with each other all at the same time. And they're all constantly evolving, and people, again, are defining them and perceiving them differently, right? And so people are coming to the table with sometimes even a different set of information or a different way of thinking about that information.
And with that, you pretty much answered my next question, was what is it about, some of these big complex problems or big complex issues, especially when it comes to, projects and trying to meet deadlines and things that contribute to conflicts in general? That was a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like given this period of time that we're in, right, like the urgency and the complexity and the nuance of it all, I think part of the challenge is acknowledging the fact that there are these really big challenges, and we are going to constantly have to come back to the drawing board and come to the table, right? And so I don't know, in my opinion, I don't know how possible it is to 100% solve a problem and then that be that, and you never have to touch it again, right? And I think that's like a hard pill to swallow when a lot of us have been conditioned and socialized to find the answer, check the box, move on to the next thing.
Yeah. I would say also it's what Liz was saying before, when we all come to things in a different way. We have different experiences, we have different communication styles, we have different perceptions of what's happening based on our role expectations and things like that. Somebody from finance versus somebody coming from marketing versus somebody coming from a role like ours where we're designing curriculum and stuff, we're going to have very different perceptions of what's happening, right? And so I think that sort of, we might think about it as accuracy, like how accurate are we perceiving a conflict? And accuracy is kind of a tricky word. There's a lot of research around that. One of our colleagues, Ariel Avgar, actually has done quite a bit of research on the accuracy we have in teams to actually diagnose a conflict. But I think with complex problems where you have multiple conflicts happening at the same time, or multiple issues that are coming up at the same time, one person might see the task conflict very clearly. How we do things is where we're having a conflict, versus the person next to them might say, no, it's a process conflict. We can't even decide how we're going to do things. So it's the decision-making process. It's like coming up with the process we're going to use. And that's really the problem. If we could fix that, we could get to the task. And then another person in that same team might say, no, it's because we don't get along. It's the relationships.
And I think like different problems or challenges or conflicts are like prioritized for people or rise to that level of urgency or importance for different people for different reasons, right? And so there might be some, interpersonal conflict of someone raising their voice and talking in a disrespectful manner, while in the context of us trying to figure out a task or a process for somebody who being spoken to that way might bring up a lot of feelings, like that's going to come top of mind to them. And it might be challenging for them to think about all of the other factors because of something that is so deeply like personal to them in that moment. And that could be the case for all of the different things in all of the different ways. It's like one of those, like, I don't know, puzzles, or you can do it 15 different ways or whatever and still get the, I don't know.
Very true. And I actually wanted to follow up with you, Katrina, was, how often do you see where there's that conflict between, say, finance and marketing, whereas, marketing has to look at a project in a certain way and finance has to look at it in a different way. And, maybe the, project manager has to look at it in one way. How often do you see these conflicts arise just based off their department needs?
Quite often, right? Because in the workplace, we're focused on the goals that we have and the role expectations that we have. And it impacts or affects our perception of anything that's going on, right? Because we're dealing with it from like where we sit in the world, in this place, where we sit in the workplace. And so if I'm a finance person, I'm going to be looking at the bottom line. I'm going to be looking at the numbers. I'm going to be looking at, where can we cut costs in a particular project or program or something like that. Whereas, you might hear, and not trying to stereotype marketing folks, but you might hear a marketing person try to say something like, we have to spend money to make money.
Okay.
Which might be a very scary statement to somebody who's trying to rein in the budget.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's good to know. And audience, thank you so much for your responses. And with that, we have another question for you. So again, while you have your phones out. So our second question, with this idea of mind, thinking about, your answer to the first question, as far as, what's a project you're working on, as far as a team goes, we want to know, what do you feel is the biggest challenge as far as you and the team you're working with and trying to finish that project? And again, we'll kind of wait for your responses. So when it comes to conflict and trying to solve a problem as a team, or in your experience, how often is there someone in the middle? So, for example, we had mentioned, the difference between marketing and finance. Is there ever somebody in the middle, or how often is there usually somebody in the middle?
I think it depends, honestly. And I have to apologize because I use that a lot, because many of the things we go through are context specific, right? So it could look similar or it could look different from many other places, right? So I think it depends. Part of it depends on the work relationship and functionality between teams, right? If they have a solid process and sort of even unspoken agreements, how are we going to communicate? How are we going to problem solve? How are we going to work through these things? Quite often there might not be anybody in the middle, right? I think sometimes as conflict escalates, right, even if you have some of those parameters around communication and how are we going to do problem solving together and those types of things, if you have those parameters and you still can't come to an agreement, right, there's still some kind of an impasse, quite often then it's taken to the next level. And that's where you might get folks in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd also add that it seems like it's often more than 2 or 3 parties, right? Okay. And so there could be like multiple people in the middle, or there could be some positions by nature of the work that they do, if they're a specific position that helps with the communication between departments to get things done. For example, I'm thinking like a project manager like role or something like that. Like that could end up being a middleman or middle person position without it being like I am coming to mediate this between you.
And audience, thank you for your response. And it seems like communication is really the big one there. We have different priorities, competing priorities as well. But I really want to focus on that kind of decision-making one. That's one that jumped out to me. And maybe, Liz, you can answer this, but do you see a lot of conflict arise when it comes to ultimately who has the final say? Usually, especially when it comes to projects, there's usually 1, maybe 2 person people who have the final say. But do you see that often where there's a conflict that arises when it comes to who makes the final decision?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because immediately I'm like, what would you classify as the final decision? If that makes sense, right? Like I feel like a lot of, because of the complex nature of the challenges, a lot of the projects themselves are complex and ever evolving, right? And so it's what might be the final project to one person might be just closing the chapter on the next jumping off point to another. I think to answer, I guess, the question more specifically, I feel like sometimes there are decisions that are made on the smaller scale that don't, the people making those decisions might not think that they are decisions that people should be providing input on, quite frankly. And then you like get to the next level or the next level in the project, and someone maybe in like a higher up position or in a different department or something is like, wait, when did we decide that this was going to be this? And so now it's a question of whose purview is it to make these sort of smaller decisions. So I think that's kind of where I see it more. Is it whose responsibility is it, or who can make XYZ decision, and who needs to be included in that decision-making process?
And Katrina, same thing.
Yeah, so I would echo what Liz is saying and just build on that a bit to say, I think the example that Liz just gave in terms of sort of those smaller decisions building up to larger sort of navigational issues for a project or something like that is indicative of the idea that maybe we didn't talk about that.
Right.
Maybe we didn't communicate about that
Of course.
before the project started or as the project was starting. And so one might say, can you really blame the person that made those decisions? There wasn't a set question of whether they should be making those decisions or how they should be doing it or anything like that. They were just doing their job, right? And so I think that it kind of helps us to see when it comes to problem solving, when it comes to teamwork or cross teamwork, particularly in organizations that tend to have a bit of a flatter structure where teams might have a lot of autonomy. It's so important to do the proactive work of saying, not just this is the project, this is the list of tasks associated with that project, but as things come up, how are we going to make decisions? How are we going to do things? How are we going to communicate? How are we going to problem solve, et cetera? If you have that proactive work when something comes up, right, you can say, oh, well, let's have a team discussion about this. Let's figure this out. And we decided we're going to use a process of consensus to move forward, or we have this person who's the decision maker, Nick's our decision maker of the team, to decide if we're down to two options, which one we're going to do. You know, something like that, where you've got a decision-making process, you've got a way to bring it up because you've decided we're going to have a team meeting if X.
Of course.
Right.
And, you know, with this idea of, you know, kind of the different processes and everything like that, when we, you know, think about deep listening, and we touched a little bit on this in our first conversation, but when it comes to this idea of deep listening, how can this idea help solve problems and help those who may be less assertive? Obviously, you know, especially anytime we're trying to problem solve, we have, you know, many different ideas and things like that. And people obviously, you know, want to stand by their ideas. But can this idea of deep listening help us when somebody's maybe less assertive or more assertive when we're trying to solve a problem?
Absolutely. So I think it's kind of a loaded question. I'll just put that out there.
We love those.
Yes, because it has a bit of complexity in itself, because it begs the question of why is somebody feeling less assertive, or why is a particular communication style not working for somebody. And so I think first and foremost, deep listening requires us, as I said, to suspend judgment.
Of course.
And also to understand what the other person is saying, right? So if you pair what we talked about in the last session we had together, if you pair deep listening with reflection, where you're reflecting back to the person what you heard, you can confirm whether you got it right or not.
Of course.
And they can correct things, or you can give them the space, ask the question to invite them to correct things, right? So that's first and foremost, because you're not just jumping on whatever they said to respond or to diminish or things like that. I think second of all, you know, when we think about communication styles, I think one of the things that's sometimes largely missing in at least in our US-based workplaces is the consideration of using communication approaches that are not just verbal. So deep listening, reflection can actually work with written communication. It can work with sort of anonymous feedback, right? Some people, particularly based on power imbalances, right? If I'm a new employee at a workplace, there's a good chance I might be less assertive.
Of course.
Because I'm still navigating, like, when is it appropriate for me to say different things? When is it appropriate for me to bring up things? All of that kind of stuff. And so considering those communication approaches, I think, is another big piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I love what you just conceptualized for us. 'Cause I think there's also this piece of some of us weren't socialized or conditioned to have access to some of these communication styles, right? So like some of us didn't grow up in cultures or communities where it was encouraged to share your opinion or thoughts about something if you aren't explicitly asked for it first, right? And so I think that's important for all of us to be cognizant of, you know, everyone isn't going to be assertive or not assertive for these singular reasons, but because of all of the things that have added up in their lives and all of the circumstances and experiences that got them to this moment in time where they are in this situation. And that's true for everyone in the room. And some people are more aware of that than others, right? And so that also will contribute to whatever dynamics come up, because sometimes you might have people who are on the more aware side trying to share that with people who are not on the more aware side, and then it feels weird and like therapizing and stuff. So you got to be careful.
Yes. And actually, with that in mind, I have a great follow-up question from Lisa. And Lisa asks, you know, what if someone is not cooperative? So obviously we have, you know, somebody who may just be reserved or their personality is just, you know, quiet, like you said, Liz. But what if someone is not cooperative at all? How do we, you know, take a step back and say, okay, how can we bring them back into the conversation and fold them back and, you know, try to get what they're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, I always start with asking myself what I'm missing, something I learned from Katrina in our class, and considering the multitude of possibilities with the information that I have in front of me of why this person or these people might not be cooperating. So were there past experiences in X workplace or X situation where they were asked for their opinions and they were asked to be problem solvers in a group, and what they said wasn't considered and someone just made the executive decision anyway? Like, was their trust broken in a prior situation similar-ish to some extent to this one that impacts or influences why someone is reacting the way that they are? And if that is the case, which, you know, we all act the way that we do for a reason, so I'm sure that there is something behind those reservations. What can I do, or what do I have the capacity to do? What skills, tools do I have to meet that person where they're at, if this is a relationship that I value and if this is a voice that I want to hear from? And how can I communicate that to them in a way that's not pushing them to do something that they're not ready to do, right? Like, so with, you know, what Katrina said, deep listening can be both verbal and also nonverbal. Maybe this person just needs a feedback survey and they need time to sit, think, process, and reflect and put it into words, right? Maybe this person is like me. I really hate typing things, right? So like sometimes I'm like, if you really want to know what I have to say, I'm going to send you a voice memo. And that's like accessible for me. And you can do the talk to text or whatever and figure it out on your end. But like, this is how I'm going to share my thoughts if you really want them. And if that's okay with you, that's what we're going to do.
I'm going to start using voice memos.
I love that.
Now that I know I can. Thank you, Liz. And, you know, with that, one thing that's really come to mind is, you know, when we had our first keynote, you know, it was a lot of, you know, this idea of deep listening one-on-one. But can we use some of those techniques as part of a group, for example?
Absolutely. Yes, I keep saying absolutely a lot, and I'm just realizing. So I think it's really helpful sometimes when we are doing community building and things like that. We'll do group dialogues, and basically we use reflection as a tool in those group dialogues. And it could be community building for the sake of community building, or it could be community building for the sake of problem solving. We also do problem solving circles, things like that. And that's where everybody in the circle has the opportunity to speak, but before speaking, so before answering the question or something like that, the person who is next in the circle would reflect back what they heard from that last person and confirm that they got it right, or ask for corrections, so that like it's very clear, it's clarifying for everybody in the circle, right? And then they can move on to answer the question themselves or provide an idea if it's like a brainstorming type session or things like that. But it can be used as a way of focusing our listening and making sure we're clear on what others are saying as well as on what we want to share.
And, when it comes to obviously, deep listening and, ultimately problem solving as part of a group, how do we, balance, trying to say like, okay, is this what you meant versus maybe not offending someone or something along those lines?
So I think the reflection piece is a good place to focus here. So focused listening or deep listening that we've talked about really keys us in to hear keywords and phrases that the person is using, right? So to use their words, and it keys us in also to the emotional tone that they're using so that we can be aware of that. And so then you sort of flip that and use it in the reflection. So you're not putting words in their mouths. You're not interpreting what they're saying. You're literally mirroring back. And I say mirroring carefully because it's not parroting, right? We don't want to parrot back. We don't want to like take a transcript of what they say and read it back. But we do want to emphasize what they're emphasizing. And so in doing that, we're understanding their perspective, their perception, et cetera, better, which theoretically should help us in framing our own response to a question or a brainstorming session or a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate the throwing the theoretically in there, right? Because all of these are tools and skills that we have to practice, right? And so also remembering just that there is, I don't know if there's a such thing as a perfect reflection that comes anywhere close to Katrina's great reflections in class, but
I have lots of room to improve.
as we all do. But also, when we work through these skills and tools with our students, we remind them that like when you're reflecting, it's not about you, right? Like it's great that you can relate. It's great that you had a similar experience. You're going to have your time to share that after you reflect back what the person before you just shared, right? Because you're giving this reflection for them and for the rest of the group to make sure that we're on the same page. And I think because we are, like, humans are relational beings, it's like our second nature to be like, oh, you shared this, I have had this similar experience, or I 100% agree, right? But that kind of takes away from their story a little bit when you share that immediately versus really prioritizing what you just heard from them and then sharing what you have to share afterwards.
And when it comes to, obviously that reflection piece, can that help us to, maybe uncover some underlying issues as far as, maybe how another team member problem solves or, their experience and how they're attacking a specific problem? Yeah,
I love that question because the answer is, for me, 100% yes, if you're doing the focused listening and paying attention to it, right? So like we get a lot of information from each other with body language and phrasing and all of those things, right? So it could be very insightful for you to see how someone's answering a specific question, to think largely about like what their thought process might look like in respect to like that specific situation. I also think that these skills are so helpful in really creating that space for people to just like think in like silence for a little bit, right? Like you in the moment, you are completely focused on answering this question, or that's the hope, right? Like you're completely focused on answering this question, and you'll hopefully have, a minute or two to gather your thoughts. And if you need a sticky note, jot down some notes. But I don't know how many of us like have that much time to like really sit down and think about a question and process and reflect to be able to give an answer without this like the urgency that I was talking about right earlier to immediately answer the question so that you can keep the conversation going and keep the back and forth going. Like I think it's really powerful because we all are reflecting and thinking in different ways and at different speeds, and it's the space is important, but I don't know if we get it as much as we should.
I try to write notes, but as you can see, the pen is just it's just here. It's just a toy for me.
Toys are fun though.
They are. They really are. And Katrina, you touched on this a little bit, and I want to make sure I get to this question because Joseph asked a little bit about this when it comes to the power dynamic, essentially. So Joseph wanted to know, do you have any tips for managing up a more senior employee that often creates conflicts? So maybe there's a manager or director or something that creates the conflict. How do we use deep listening to help kind of solve that conflict?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because managing up is such a useful but complex and difficult skill.
Okay.
And I will say, I co-learn constantly with managing up, managing down, managing across. You know, it's because it's different in every context, and part of it is dependent on what is the conflict exactly with this particular manager, because that can make a big difference in how you approach it. But I do think that quite often when we're managing up or we're trying to manage up, we're trying to, in some ways, sort of put up a mirror for a person, right? To have them consider other perceptions or perspectives on what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're interacting, whatever the issue might be, how they're making decisions, etc. Sometimes I think with the deep listening, simply having sort of a framing of curiosity and asking a question to that person, and then being able to use deep listening or focused listening and then reflect back what they've said to make sure that you're fully understanding that person is often a space that managers aren't given, right? Because they're supposed to have the answer. They're supposed to have the decision all set. They're supposed to be assertive. There's all of these sort of like professional connotations to management, right? And so they have a lot of expectations on themselves and are often given the space to actually hear back what they just said, and that might give them perspective too.
Interesting. And with that, Mike checks in with an interesting question. So Mike asks, how can I adjust my deep listening approach when I don't have much in common with somebody? So e.g., background, age, economic status, and still be genuine. So there's a lot there. Thanks, Mike.
I think we have so much more in common with each other than we give ourselves credit for, right? Like we all breathe the same air. I know it's like cheesy, but like seriously, I feel like living in Ithaca, and especially living in Ithaca as an adult, right? Because I was a student for 6 years and wasn't really paying attention to the beautiful natural environment around us. But that perspective of, wow, like in the grand scheme of things, we humans are just these teeny tiny little people on this massive planet. And so like that just universal experience of we're here alive and breathing the air and the gratitude that comes with that, I think is a really beautiful place to start. And then also like the weather and food. Like, I don't know, I feel like we've lost small talk a little bit post in like the after 2020 like lockdown days, right? Like we lost a lot of those smaller, less serious like connections with the person in the grocery store line behind you that has a shirt you like, So I think leaning into that a little bit more is always my like number one tip for those types of questions. But
I would also say, keeping in mind that we definitely have more connections than we think we might.
Of course.
At the same time, understanding that deep listening can, I think, in some ways be more impactful or powerful with the people you don't have 100%. A lot in common with. Yeah. Because you are genuinely trying to understand where they're coming from because that's not your experience.
Of course.
Right? And so if you come to it with a genuine curiosity, if you come to it and reflect that genuine curiosity, I think it can make a really impactful connection of just being open and providing that space to the other person.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way that you phrase that sentence, like if you come to it with a genuine curiosity, because I think in this entire conversation, a lot of it is a mindset thing, right? It's like, number one, you're not going to get it right every single time, but also like who defines getting it right or wrong, right? So like taking that pressure off of yourself to know that like at least I'm trying, like I'm consciously trying to be attentive and be intentional and like connect and engage with people. But also like there's so much that we all have to learn from each other. And I think that's also really helpful in the grand scheme of things, right? With humanity and existence and living in a society and in communities, right? Is knowing and remembering and having access to all of these different perspectives and outlooks is like really powerful and what makes us really strong and where all of our best innovations and all of those things come from. So, yeah.
And thank you for that. And Mike, thank you for that question. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about, in our first conversation, we talked about how conflict, can sometimes be a good thing. So with this, with everything in mind that we've been talking about, why is conflict a good thing, especially when it comes to trying to solve a problem or trying to finish a project or, get something done?
Yeah. I think my answer is a little bit abstract, building off of what I just said. But if I go into every conflict thinking it's a bad thing, that's going to influence my results.
Okay.
And how I'm navigating it, right?
Yeah.
And so going into conflicts, knowing that they are inevitable and there's no possible way that I could avoid them and that like work out for me, net positive in the long run, right? Is like kind of ground zero. And then thinking about them and going into them with that curiosity of what can I learn or grow from out of this situation, right? Because there's always going to be just a little bit more context or perspective that you're going to get from every single experience you have if you're going into them with the mindset of I'm going to like learn something out of this. And then that's not to say it's going to be easy and, smooth sailing ahead. Like it'll be a bumpy road, but also it is always going to be a bumpy road. Right?
So true.
Yeah, I would add on to that to say, I think conflict is often perceived as a negative thing, right? So often when I go into organizations, they're seeking to eradicate conflict altogether. And it's like, that actually probably wouldn't be helpful because you never have any variation of perspective or ideas. And so brainstorming and things like that would become very difficult. Right. And so it's a matter of reframing conflict in our heads to acknowledge that, yes, it can be destructive, but it can also be constructive. And the power of conflict and problem solving and things like that is the opportunity for creative solutions and options. It's also the ability for team members to build perspective, right? And to take perspective, which is huge in terms of anybody's development, no matter at what stage of your career you're in, right? And I think the downfall with conflict in the workplace is often that we don't have a process or an acknowledgement that it's inevitable. Right. It's going to come up. So we have to figure out, okay, so when a conflict does come up, it might come in the form of a disagreement. How are we going to approach it? How do we have this communication to understand and respect that we have different perspectives, but to incorporate those different perspectives?
Yeah. And how do we build a capacity for grace and understanding and patience while also being able to like hold each other accountable and be honest, considering the fact that like if conflict is going to be inevitable, especially when you're communicating about the conflict, right? So like within the conversation, it's inevitable that someone's going to say something that rubs someone the wrong way.
Of course.
How can we address that when it needs to be addressed? Take a step back, give apologies where they need, you know what I'm saying? Do all of that. And I think a lot of it is like the pressure that we put on ourselves to do it right and not make any mistakes. And so for me, like in my personal life and in this work, like that constant reminder that it is literally not possible for me to go through the day and not make a mistake. And it would like I would be a bit more miserable if I had that pressure on myself to do everything right all of the time. That doesn't excuse my actions when I slip up or hurt someone's feelings or whatever. But that mindset does make it easier for me to own it, right? Because I know that that's not what my intention is. Like my intention is never to, well, I can't say never sometimes, but anyway, my intention is never to like antagonize or like hurt someone or cause someone harm. But that does happen sometimes without me even realizing. And so how do you balance that?
I really just want to know, Katrina, how often do you have to go into organizations and be like, listen, conflict is not always a bad thing?
I would say like
Often.
85% of the time when we're doing client work, that's one of the like baselines that needs to be set. And it's because conflict is scary. It really is.
Of course.
Because it can literally dismantle a team or an organization.
It has,
right?
and it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fact that it's inevitable sometimes doesn't make it feel any less scary. It just makes us want to avoid it more, right? So I think it's a common baseline that has to be set. And it's setting that baseline with the understanding that there are ways to engage with conflict, that it doesn't have to be that scary, that it doesn't have to be that destructive. So it's figuring out, okay, what are the ways that's going to work for your team, for your organization? And often that's different for every team and organization.
Right. And I think it's also important for us to, again, with this like this patience and grace theme, it's like really on my heart today, but recognizing that we all have been socialized and conditioned to some extent avoid the conflict, right? Like it's always been framed for the most part as something negative. And so like, it's okay that it's uncomfortable. Like we're not saying that like we're going to practice these skills and it'll be like easy peasy lemon squeezy every time you have to confront somebody. Right. And like, that's okay. That's where we build the most like strength and resilience, is like working through the hard stuff. And also like we can do it.
And just very, very quickly, we had talked a little bit about reflection. Katrina, you had mentioned it. And Amanda checks in just very, very quickly. She wants to know, can you give an example of how mirroring might sound? I think I'm at risk of 1, getting it wrong, or 2, just rearranging their words.
Okay.
So there's a lot there.
So probably the easiest way to do this would be if I asked Liz to say something, and I'll attempt to reflect it back.
I'm a hard person to reflect. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
No, you're not a hard person to reflect at all.
All right, let's go. Liz.
So maybe just something about types of conflict in organizations that you've experienced.
So I think one of the big types of conflict that I notice is going back to what we were talking about earlier about decision making. And when people in like higher positions of power make decisions about how things are going to be done, and the people who are going to be doing those things were not involved in those conversations. And so those decisions will ultimately impact their working conditions and what they're going to have to do on a day-to-day basis. And it might interfere with things that they have going on with their personal life or other work things. But the person who made that decision wouldn't know that and wouldn't have considered those things because they didn't ask the worker or employee.
So in terms of kind of what you've noticed in organizations, you wanted to key in on the decision-making process, particularly when it's a high-power individual, like with the power dynamics. A high-power individual is making a decision that perhaps they don't have input on from other folks, or they haven't asked, and that decision may impact the other folks, either their personal life, their work life, etc. And so it's a huge dynamic of that sort of power dynamic in conjunction with decision making.
Yeah, that's so good. So I knew it was going to be fun.
So that I tried to key in on a couple of different words there, just to use that as an example. So one was, Liz specifically said she noticed, right? So I wanted to use the word notice. She also used high power individuals as a phrase. So I wanted to make sure that I did that. And also how it affects or impacts people that don't have a voice in that decision was an important concept to what Liz was saying. So I tried to key in on those things without parroting it back. So in some ways, it's kind of like summarizing, but summarizing using Liz's words as much as possible instead of using my own.
Yes. And you'll notice Katrina didn't say like, that 100% makes sense. I've been in workplaces where blah, 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 give example of her experience and then continue to add on.
Of course. Perfect. Saw it from the master. Thank you for that. Thank you
Definitely
for that
not the
question.
master.
Thank you for that question, man. Then I want to talk a little bit about, some different techniques that we can use as far as, the team dynamic goes. So what are some different ways we can implement deep listening as part of, a team or in a team environment when we're trying to, solve a problem or, finish a project?
So I think we touched on a few of these earlier that might help. So one is thinking about it in terms of how we might want to use it in team meetings, or for a very particular purpose. So team meetings, especially when things are maybe a little more heated, the idea of using deep listening in combination with reflection, if you make that an agreement among your team that you're going to reflect back what you just heard before countering it or adding a different idea or something like that, can allow enough of a pause to consider how are we going to add our counterpoint, or how are we going to add an additional option to what's been given or something like that, right? So it just provides, I think sometimes when things gets heated, it can provide just enough of a pause that maybe it's going to keep us level instead of escalating beyond the point of control, right? I think another way that we can use it is kind of in that problem solving sort of circle mode. So I like to use it in brainstorming. I think it's really powerful in brainstorming because, and you don't necessarily have to sit in a circle for this, right? So a lot of people feel like, okay, that's a little too personal for me. I'm not sure I want to sit in a circle. You could be sitting around a conference table. You could be sitting on Zoom, right, with your team. But when we're brainstorming, we're often throwing out ideas so quickly that we may either miss an idea that's being thrown out, or we may miss the point of an idea. So as we're doing that, again, it's just enough of a pause to use focused listening. And if you share an idea and I want to share one, I'm going to reflect back what your idea was first to make sure I understood the idea and the point of the idea before I share my idea. Right? And it gives us just enough of a pause to make sure we're not losing any ideas, and we're also understanding the point. And in understanding the point, it may clarify our own thinking and create even more options.
I'll also add really quickly, sometimes in brainstorming, and I'm guilty of this, there's an idea, but there is no point. I'm just saying things. And so when you're asking these clarifying questions, it's an indicator for me when people are having a hard time getting to the point that I need to think a little further and develop that idea, and the space can support me in developing that idea, because it's not like I'm just not having a point because I don't want to have one. I just haven't gotten there yet, so we can get there together.
And how do we balance that idea of listening and responding without things not boiling over or reaching a tipping point?
That's a tough question because that's always a possibility.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So like for me, I don't really think about it as trying to not make that happen, but how can I prepare myself for when that does happen, right? So like for me, if I am in a space where I am included in the boilingness, I will need to remove myself from the hot pot because it's not cute when Liz gets simmery, right? So I know that about myself, but also in like team dynamics, like if you spend enough time with your team, you can pick up on, little signals or hand motions or body language things where you're like, someone might not be jiving with this conversation. So you can propose, all right, let's take a 15-minute bio break, go get some water, get a snack. I do think also sometimes when these meetings and brainstorming sessions are happening too close to lunch, and people's blood sugar's dropping, that's an indicator to regroup afterwards once we have a little bit more energy, that type of thing. So like I'm like a very much like plan B through Z type of girl, because things are always going to come up.
Okay, so Liz, Katrina, no brainstorming sessions before or right after lunch?
I think if you're going to, you better provide snacks.
Absolutely. We are very pro snacks.
Yes.
And we do lots of brainstorming over eating.
Yes. Yes. And I will say too, I mean, I think the way that you framed the question was interesting, right? Because you said listening to respond, right? So if we're using deep listening and reflection, we're not listening to respond. So that's one of the huge impacts that has on a team dynamic, especially if things are getting escalated or heated, because it forces us to pull back on the response part and to understand first before responding.
And just very quickly, I know we got this question in last time, but are there any good books on deep listening that you both would recommend?
So there's definitely several books that I would say are good, that are kind of in the realm of transformative mediation. So Joe Folger and Baruch Bush are sort of the originators, the godfathers of transformative mediation, so to speak. And so if you look for books, I think their original book was actually called The Promise of Mediation, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's kind of interesting because they go through mediation as a tool, but they also talk about some of those sort of sub-tools or skills that we use, like focused listening and reflective feedback. There are also a couple of handbooks. So there's the Transformative Mediation Handbook that provides more detailed information on these skills in particular. But then there's other approaches to it, right? So if we think about just the skill of focused listening and reflective feedback, that connects with noticing and naming things, right? And so one of my favorite books that has helped me personally with that is called Action Inquiry, and it's by William Torbert and Associates. It's based on constructive developmental theory, which is a psychological theory, but it helps us to understand, like, what are we not noticing? What are we not naming? What are we kind of being oblivious to? And then how do we actually start to frame our own collaborative, I guess, interventions. So he actually uses what he calls the 4 parts of speech, which are framing, illustrating, advocating, and inquiring. And so I use those constantly. You can put them all within like 1 or 2 sentences, and it helps after using focused listening and reflective feedback to then craft, okay, this is sort of my response after understanding better, but I'm still going to use a question at the end of it to invite dialogue.
And for those managers or leaders out there who kind of want to, implement this idea of deep listening as part of their team, what's kind of the first step for them, or what's that one thing they should keep top of mind when they're thinking about, hey, I should kind of implement this as part of, team building?
So I would say if you're a manager, if you're one of the managers out there who wants to implement this into your workplace, I would do a little bit more research beyond these 2 webinars. And I would spend some time practicing and working through the skills and tools yourself before putting it into the workplace and just testing things out. Because I think we're seeing lots of things being implemented that aren't fully developed. Okay. And that has also been contributing to some of these conflicts, because people are going to have questions, right? And especially if you're introducing this is a tool, deep listening, people are going to be like, okay,
is this one of our soft skill interventions?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would definitely go with that as a first step. Just try it on for yourself first, because then you can speak to it genuinely.
Yeah.
Second, I would say just have a conversation about it. Say, we want to kind of create this environment where we can hear each other better, as well as be more creative together. And one of the ways that we can possibly do this is by changing up our communication dynamics a little bit. So this is one of the things that I was thinking of. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's maybe try it out in a meeting and see what happens.
Yeah. And don't hesitate to reach out for help
Yeah.
and support if you need it. There's lots of practitioners out there who are doing really good work and supporting people and having these transformative conversations. So don't put all the pressure on yourself to like do a dissertation's worth of research in a couple of nights and then present it at the staff meeting.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
I'd be interested to know how should managers think when there's, when they have different generations on their team. So it seems like, now more than ever, there's, heightened sense of using the right language and everything like that. So how should managers think about this when it comes to, generational differences and just our experiences in general based on our ages?
I would say baseline, think about it. And acknowledge that that's a part of the reason why people are showing up to spaces differently. People are, and also like don't lean too heavily into the stereotypes, right? Like people aren't just like being lazy and annoying. Like they have been, I mean, if like I'm 26, right? So like whenever I'm having conversations with people and contextualizing my like thought process, I'm like, I have been on this earth from 1998 to 2024, right? Think about the things that have happened in the last 6 years alone since I became an adult, okay? And think about how that could inform or influence how I'm coming to this conversation right now. Baseline.
Yeah, absolutely baseline. I think also considering understanding that baseline a little bit more, right? So the social contract in the workplace has changed over the years, and that's an important recognition that we often don't recognize.
Okay.
So, if you look pre-1980s, the social contract in the workplace was all about loyalty and longevity, right? If you're good to the company's good to you, right? Post 1980 to about, I'd say maybe 5 to 7 years ago.
Okay.
Although we see it more heavily since the pandemic. I would say the social contract was more of an individualist approach, right? We got more into a recruiting era. We got more into companies and organizations offering more individual benefits, right? Because we saw unionization going down. So there was less collective bargaining and more individual contracts people were negotiating. And so they were looking for, what are my professional development opportunities? What are my available salary increases? How far can I move in this company? And how, appropriate for a position outside this company is this going to make me? Right. And so that started to become the social contract, where there was an understanding, like, if you're a healthy and a good company or organization, you're going to be the company that offers all sorts of funds for professional development and opportunities for advancement. Right. But also be open to the fact that you're probably going to have turnover, and it's okay if people are cycling out. Okay. And then more recently, we've found there's been another shift, and that shift has been, I won't say totally generationally different, but we're seeing it impact the generations differently. And that is, there's, particularly since the pandemic, there's this work-life balance, push and pull, right? And we can see that in multiple different ways. We see that in value-oriented conversations and conflicts in organizations. We see that in, flex work schedules and things like that. How much are you working remotely versus how much are you working in person? How much should we be pushing for one or the other? Does it matter what industry you're in? But we're seeing all of these things that are sort of work-life balance, but it's a combination of individual work-life balance and social work-life balance. And I say social in the sense of like community. How is this impacting my world? And so we're actively going through, what does that mean? And so that's bound to be a conflict, and that's going to impact somebody who's on the verge of retirement very differently from somebody who just joined the workforce.
Very true. Well, Katrina, Liz, I could listen to you both all day. Honestly, I really could, and I'm sure our audience could as well. But before we wrap, just one last thing. Katrina, maybe we can hear from you first, and then Liz, you can close this out. What's that one thing you would want people to think about, or that one thing you would want people to keep top of mind as they're thinking about the concept of deep listening, as far as, you know, solving problems in the workplace and just conflicts in general?
I think the one thing that I would say keep in mind is be open to trying it and try to be intentional about using it. Because a lot of it's what we do in a workplace or what we do in a relationship or any of those things. It's about how we are coming to it and how much space we're giving to the other person coming to it and being where they're at. So just, if nothing else, just try it on.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. And I would say, building off of that, this is what I remind myself every day.
Okay.
Take a deep breath, breathe. You can't meet people where they're at if you don't know where you're at, and you got to give yourself space to figure that out.
Awesome. That is a perfect way to end. Well, Liz, Katrina, thank you again so much.
you.
Audience, thank
Thank
you. Thank
you.
you so much for joining us, and have a good afternoon, and we will see you at the next keynote.